All right. Well, good morning, Dr. Stone. Welcome back.
Thank you.
I guess we could pick up where we left off with the alphabet of
The
evil.
alphabet, yeah.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, there's something outstanding in the news,
Mhm.
and I kind of wanted an ad, like
Yeah.
It'd
Oh,
be-
if we have anything else.
yeah. So I would, in the last couple of weeks, I said, well, wait a second. I just read about this kind of case. We're going to have an extra one in the V's, or an extra one in the O's or something.
We're going to add on
We can
top
expand
of it now.
We could, it's the kind of thing you could expand pretty much into an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
A huge encyclopedia of bad guys.
As long as they keep doing bad things, huh? Keeps the books growing bigger.
Yeah. Well, this fellow was born in 1970 near Detroit in a middle-class family where his alcoholic father ran a small tool and die shop. This is Stephen Grant. He became a risk-taker with grandiose and some psychopathic traits, a daredevil who ended up with so many arrests for reckless driving, speeding, and driving without a license. In school, he was an arrogant braggart who affected to know everything, but was actually a rather indifferent student who later didn't finish college, although he would boast that he had finished college. He was fearless as an adolescent. He did a lot of shoplifting and felt he could talk his way out of any challenge to his willfulness. Basically amoral, he came up with rationalizations for doing whatever he felt like, no matter how indiscreet or illegal. He had the psychopath's superficial charm and had a number of affairs before marrying a girl he met while in college. So she was Tara, either Destrempe, to give it the French-Canadian
Fancy way
pronunciation,
of saying it.
or Destramp, I don't know how she says her name, from Michigan's Upper Peninsula. She majored in business. She was dynamic and ambitious. She was attracted to Stephen because he came from the big city, in contrast to her rural background. Hers was a healthy, hard-working family, whereas Stephen came from a dysfunctional family where the parents kept separating and getting together again in an unpredictable way. Stephen tried his luck at various jobs. He got fired from one because he stole from the cash register, and he earned very little in general. Tara was quite different. She showed great administrative abilities, and she was sent around the world for her large corporation that she worked for, and she earned quite a handsome salary. They had 2 children in 2002, 2004, but Tara was seldom home, with the result that Stephen ended up a kind of a stay-at-home dad, increasingly resentful of her absences. And he began an affair with their au pair that took care of the children, a woman by the name of Verena Dirks. Tara returned one evening in 2007 from San Juan, mentioning that she had to return there a bit earlier than she had expected, and that was for him the last straw. They argued, and in a fit of rage, he strangled her. He then pretended that she had simply abandoned the family, as if to be with a lover. He then, using his dad's tool and die equipment, never let anything go unused, he sawed and dismembered her body into 14 pieces. He discarded the pieces in a wooded area not far from the suburban home. A woman, meanwhile, found one of the garbage bags with a body part around the time that Stephen went back home to retrieve the biggest piece, which was Tara's torso, hoping to bury that portion where it would not be found. But the police did find it, and they confronted him, and Stephen now confessed and even had a twinge of remorse. Found guilty of murder and dismemberment, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. At Grant's trial, the judge called him demonic, as well as manipulative, barbaric, dishonest, and a coward. The prosecutor called him evil personified. Now, with respect to the behind-the-scenes neuroanatomical aspect of violent acts, some of which evoke from us the reaction of evil, functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, studies in that area, fMRI studies, over the past 2 decades have pointed to important differences in the brain of what has been called reactive aggression versus proactive aggression. There is an illuminating chapter in Adrian Rain's recent book. Adrian Rain is a neuroscientist who used to be from England originally. Then he spent a lot of years in San Diego, and now he's in the University of Pennsylvania. And he writes very well on the subject of crime and evil and so
okay.
on. He has a little bit of a tilt toward the left in the sense that he is not only against let's say the death penalty, but since there's so many things oftentimes wrong with the brains of these people that commit these terrible acts that I'm not saying he views it as altogether exculpatory, but it's as if it should be taken into account during sentencing.
In the effect.
As though he couldn't help doing it because of X, Y, and Z. But my attitude is, if you do something horrible and commit a terrible crime, even though you may be a little twisted on the inside, you can't have them out and about in society just because they had a bad childhood or their brain was a little twisted. They're dangerous, and so you have to at least keep them incarcerated at the very least.
You still committed the act. It's almost like drunk driving. You hit someone, you're impaired, you're intoxicated. Even though you return back to your normal
if
state,
you're drunk
you still
driving,
did it.
If you hit somebody when you're driving because you're careless, that's bad. If you're drunk, that's bad. If you're using opiates, that's bad. If you're on marijuana, that's bad. But the person you hit is dead all the same.
Doesn't affect them any
or
different.
Injured,
The effects are still the same.
Okay, so reactive aggression concerns hot-blooded persons who lash out emotionally in the face of provocative stimulus. Somebody, for example, has insulted them. They've been verbally threatened, so they hit back in anger. This contrasts with the predatory people, the proactives, who carefully plan their action and act in a methodical, logical, calculating way, and who are regulated, controlled, driven by rewards, cold-blooded, and dispassionate. Attorney Robert Rowe, who bludgeoned his family to death in a fit of despondency and rage, exemplifies the reactive type. This is a fellow who had several children, but one of them was very brain damaged from birth. And the kid was, I think, unable to talk or do anything, and
low functioning.
And for a while, he and his wife would let a group of people, parents with also a very damaged child, like let's say 3 or 4 sets of parents, and so he was doing humanitarian work in that way, compassionate about other people that had children who
had the
were
same
damaged
kind
the
of
way his
afflictions.
was. But then a bunch of things happened in his life where his mother gave all her money to his brother rather than any to him. He was a lawyer. He was doing pretty well, but he resented that very deeply. And so he sort of lost it at that point. And he went home, he took a baseball bat, and he smashed to death the damaged son, the other more normal children, and the wife.
Wow.
And he ended up in the forensic hospital, Mid-Hudson, where I used to work. And he spent a couple of years there, but he was fundamentally a decent person who just lost it.
There is that button you could press.
They kept him there. He was very depressed. They gave him antidepressants and treatment. And after a couple of years, he left. He went to an ordinary psychiatric hospital, which is this first step toward rehabilitation. You go from the forensic hospital to a regular hospital. You don't just go out and about. And then he did well there, and he finally left, and he remarried. He lost his law license, so he worked kind of as a paralegal. So, and there was a book written about him, a very sympathetic book, and it was really all happening maybe a year or two before I got to the hospital. So he was a fundamentally good person who, in the fit of rage, lost it and did a very terrible thing. Very different from the plotting, calculating, psychopathic killer.
Was he ever released?
Yes.
He was released back in the...
Yeah, he was. So Rowe, after spending several years in Forensic Hospital, where he was eventually able to overcome his depression, remarried, returned to work, and led an exemplary life. He committed one violent act in his life, but would not be considered an evil man. Stephen Grant was quite a different person, a killer of the proactive type. In his methodical, cold-blooded way, he carved up his wife, the mother of his children, after all, as though she were nothing more than a side of beef. The psychopathic wife killers who carefully conjure up clever, foolproof ways to disappear their wives are clearly of the proactive type, as are most men who commit serial sexual homicide. The word evil is regularly used in describing them, and the repugnant crimes that they commit are considered evil. Adrian Raine highlights such men as Randy Kraft and Leonard Lake. There's no shortage of others among them. Charles Albright, the man that gouged out the eyes of the prostitutes in Texas, and Ian Brady, Mike DeBartoleben, who was the most articulate because he wrote about sadism and
documented everything.
Yes, Mike DeBartoleben was a serial killer from Texas, a very vicious guy, but he came from an unfortunate background. His father was a lieutenant, a colonel, I think, in the Army, and his mother was an alcoholic, and they used to beat the hell out of him. The mother would take a knife at him, the father would beat him. So so some of his rage really stemmed, from the very bad treatment, and he became a serial sexual killer of about 5 or maybe more women. But when he was finally in prison, he wrote a kind of a manifesto where he said the essence of sadism is the wish to have total power over another woman.
Another person.
Another person, but sometimes he would write person, sometimes he would write women, since he was heterosexual, so his victims were women.
Yeah.
In other words, to be their god, because if you bind her to a chair or something, and you can whip her or do anything you want, you're for that moment you're God, and
the omnipotent power.
Yeah, you have the power. So that was to Bartleben's, and it's quite accurate. I mean, what he was saying,
he wasn't that far off.
No, he was not far off. And then other ones like Ed Kemper, the 6'9" guy, and David Parker Ray, who devised the most cunning tortures, in the toy box that he built in New Mexico. And an English couple, Fred and Rose West, who captured a lot of young women in their place in the Midlands part of England. Citing the research of several neuroscientists, including Sweden's Henrik Söderström and Ken Keel in the United States, Adrian Raine drew attention to abnormal function of certain key areas of the brain in psychopaths, including the hippocampus, the parahippocampal gyrus, and the posterior cingulate gyrus, which is just over the corpus callosum in the middle part of the brain. Pictorial plates showing those brain regions are found in the middle of Raine's book, and these findings should be understood thus far as correlational rather than causative factors in psychopathy. We don't as yet know, for example, whether abnormalities in those areas, if detected, say, in childhood, of sons born to persons like Stephen Grant, or some of the psychopaths we just talked about, or to Ted Bundy, who did sire a child after he was foolishly allowed conjugal visits when he was in prison, would destine those boys to become psychopaths, even if raised in more harmonious families. That is a task for future research, but it's hard to do the research because the Ted Bundy's child, no one knows who the hell or where he is. Only that some government agency would know where he is, because they want to protect the identity. In other words,
the identity of the child.
They protect the identity, so that the child himself may not even know that he's Ted Bundy's child.
Yeah. Wow.
So that to study, did he turn bad when he was raised in a nice foster home, or was he a nice fellow? That would be very interesting. Take John Gacy had a kid at conjugal visits. Ted Bundy. A lot of these guys have children, and if they were somehow some social agency could collect data on them 10, 15, 20 years later, we would have an idea, how many of them turned bad, and or if they were in very humane and pleasant foster parent settings. Was that enough to overcome whatever genetic tendencies they might have had, or did some of them turn bad anyway? We don't know the answer to that. I mean, we suspect that there's a genetic wrinkle in many psychopathic persons, especially the ones that don't come from terribly bad homes.
Yes.
In other words, if you come from a terribly bad home, it gets very muddied. You don't know how much the terrible home came
affected
from it,
or the genetics.
The Bartoleben, or how much it was just pure genetics that even if they were raised in a nice home, they'd still end up doing evil things.
Yeah.
So these are some as yet to be not fully answered questions.
Be interesting to see what comes out of it. I mean, you have everyone volunteering their DNA now for Ancestry.com and the rest of those.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll find out a lot
Well,
of...
we probably, like the way they found that guy, the policeman in California that was a serial killer.
That's right.
Fed through the not only the DNA, but the DNA matched the DNA of certain families, and they were able to find out who he was.
Yeah.
So.
Interesting times we live in, huh?
Yeah. So Thomas Hose was an untrained school security guard in a high school in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, which is a little town of about 20,000 people, not far from, about a little south of Pittsburgh.
Western.
Yeah. One of the students there was Tanya Katch, a 13-year-old girl from a severely disturbed family. Her father was completely indifferent toward her, but her mother was an alcoholic and a psychotic woman who divorced the father, but had earlier and on many occasions either severely scolded or else struck Tanya. Because of all the mistreatment, Tanya had often run away from home. And there were many occasions when she did that, and the school guard kind of sensed that she was a troubled girl, and by steps and stages, he befriended her, and they lured her, and ultimately seduced her.
That was Mr. Hose, right?
Hose, yeah. A man 3 times Tanya's age, he was 39, she was 13.
Jesus.
He invited her, in quotation marks, to stay in his house, where he lived with his parents. Tanya became a missing person, albeit holed up in a house only a few blocks from her father. Hose proceeded to keep her imprisoned in a small room where she was warned to be silent so that the parents, who lived downstairs, would not guess that he was holding this missing girl up there. She could no longer go to school, and she had to void her waste in a bucket. She was given nothing to do except watch TV, although eventually she was given a cat. Hose threatened to kill her if she dared to try to leave. And Tanya developed a kind of Stockholm syndrome, growing attached to her captor, although she hated him at the same time. When she turned 18, he had her change her name, so that on the rare occasions when she was permitted to go to the grocery store, people wouldn't recognize her as the well-publicized missing girl, because she had a different name now. Tanya's name was even put on milk cartons, after the manner of the other missing children, like Eden Patz and Adam Walsh, who was kidnapped, his severed head found by fishermen afterwards. Both boys had been 6 when they were abducted. So at 13, she was a much more formidable victim for a child snatcher to control, so it is a testimony of sorts to Hose's ingenuity that he managed to keep her for 10 years. He made her his sex slave, doing only anal or oral sex. We don't know whether that was out of his preferences or whether out of he figured, well, if I do that, I won't get her pregnant. It's not clear whether why he chose
those two
his orifices. He also forbade her to go to a doctor, with the result that she developed psoriasis and blurry vision because it was all untreated. She had untreated conjunctivitis, so her vision was not so good. Tanya finally managed to escape in 2006 when she was 23. It's a very large blot on the escutcheon of the local police that they put little effort into finding her. even though she was once kidnapped, and she lived within walking distance of her home.
Wow.
A similar blot on the judge when Hose was then arrested, who claimed that the police were protected from malfeasance and guilt since the statute of limitations had run out. It was a travesty of the law that in cases where a child had been unlawfully imprisoned as a sex slave, the timing began from the child's disappearance rather than from the time the child managed to escape.
Yeah, really.
So Tanya did not delay 3 or 4 years before suing the police. She did so the next day.
Immediately, yeah.
But it was pure foxiness to attend only to the letter rather than to the spirit of the law in maintaining that in a decade-long sequestration of an innocent young woman, she had, quotes, waited too long to sue. But our courts are
Great
haven't
systems.
quite caught up to the times.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, yeah.
Yeah. There was more evil in this case than Justin Thomas Hose. His sentence after trial, a mere 15 years, was also absurdly brief, considering that he had forced Tanya to be a missing person for more than 7 years. So therefore, that's the statute. She
Yeah.
was legally dead. After 7 years missing, you're legally dead.
Wow.
In this respect, Tanya joins the ranks of other children who, in the post-1960s new evil, have been held as sex slaves for protracted periods. Some, like J.C. Dugard in California and Elizabeth Fritzl in Austria, have borne children to their kidnappers. J.C. Dugard was held for 18 years, and Elizabeth Fritzl for a similar length of time. She bore 7 children to her, Joseph Fritzl,
To her captor,
father.
yeah. Oh, to her father.
To her father, yes,
Oh, wow.
who had built a bunker below the home in Vienna,
Mhm.
where he made 7. She was one of 7 children that he had by the legitimate wife.
Mhm.
But then he, in the bunker he built below, he captured and kept Elizabeth there for 18 years and had 7 more children, who had never seen the outside. They only
Never
saw
seen-
the world by television.
Wow. They
Yeah.
lived in a bunker. For how long? I mean, any amount of time is horrible, but
Yeah, but he kept her there for 18 years.
her there for 18 years.
And
the
then
kids?
some of the kids were there for 15 years, 12 years, the very lengthy periods of time.
Wow.
And we don't know what they're now freed and put in a special home somewhere and trying to
Live a life.
Therapists are trying to enable them to have the best kind of
Quality of life
adjustment they can. But it must be very difficult when imagine seeing the sun only on television for
Yeah.
all your life and until you're about 15 years old.
Jesus.
Incredible,
It's literally a whole new world.
Yeah.
Everything's, wow. Everything's fresh.
So now, fortunately, Tanya was able to make a good recovery, and she finished her interrupted schooling. She finished high school, went to college, she married, and she wrote a book about her capture and her eventual escape. So that she did better than a lot of the others.
She conquered her, the fears.
Probably has just a few more years to go.
Probably getting
It's
out pretty
ridiculous.
soon, huh? Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Yeah.
And it's because she's alive, huh?
Yes,
Would you say?
That's another big problem. With the law doesn't deal well with the distinction attempted murder and actual murder.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if you shoot at somebody and they survive because the bullet went a couple of millimeters east or west of the aorta, or you really sure as hell meant to kill them.
Yeah.
So the sentence ought to be, very close to or equal to as if you had murdered them.
Of course, yeah.
Intent
Intent was to kill.
There are some iffy exceptions or circumstances that are a little more difficult to judge. I got involved one time when I was working at Mid Hudson at the forensic hospital with a man who had shot at his wife. He was a black guy who was a carpenter, and he worked very hard to put his wife through law school.
Mm-hmm.
When she was in law school, she fell in love with another law student,
Of course.
and they had a 13-year-old daughter,
Mhm.
and so was very upset, that he was abandoned. Here he worked so hard to put her through law school, and then she
ups and
abandons
leaves
him,
him.
to shack up with a new guy that she met in law school. And he was a very religious person, very devout Christian, and so he became enraged, and he shot her as she was walking toward the door, with her back to him. He shot her in the buttocks.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't. It was like a
Attempt to maim.
an
not
attempt
attempt to kill, but attempt
to
to
punish her
harm.
severely.
Yeah.
For what it wasn't a shot meant to kill, and it didn't kill her. I mean, but he was put. Of course, he was considered paranoid or schizophrenic, which he was not, and ended up in the forensic hospital. The thing was, he went down to he escaped for a while, went down to Florida, but then he had a kind of a religious experience where he said, I did the wrong thing, and he went back up and he turned himself in. So he wasn't a psychopath. He was.
He had some
he was a good
conscience to
guy.
him then, yeah.
He was a good guy, and so.
Just got a little bit mad.
But they put him in for a long time in the forensic hospital, and I felt he was somebody that should have been allowed to go to a regular psychiatric hospital after a while, and then see if he couldn't get
Following that reactive, the reactive.
this one
yeah.
bad thing he did in his life. Who was a more virtuous person than the wife, whom he shot in the tush.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah, that's the legal system, huh?
yeah.
Leaves it open that way.
Because they could have argued, what if the bullet hit the femoral artery, and in which case you would have bled out.
You would have bled
so
out.
I mean, they have a point, but these are very subtle.
But
you
that's
have to
why
take into consideration the mindset of the person. Was the person with a long criminal record or had a criminal mind, or was it really a good person? And for instance, if he shot her in the chest, where it was the lungs of the heart, it could be much more nearly fatal, even if she managed to survive. The punishment might be more in line with,
The action, then.
she survived, but it was basically an attempted murder, in contrast to shooting her in the leg or the buttocks. So, but that's for there you need a clever and expensive defense attorney, which people in their circumstances wouldn't have.
We have one. Let's call him artist, a comedian that we work with here, and he just got out of I think it was 12 or 15-year prison term himself for what you just said, shooting someone in the ass. And it was one of those things at a nightclub. It was not defensive, it was more of a warning shot. And he hit the guy in the butt cheek and spent 12 years in prison for shooting a guy in the ass for attempted murder. Just like what you talked about.
Yeah. So Stephen Ray Harper was born in 1953 in a middle-class family in Nebraska. When he was 9, he was severely burned over 2/3 of his body, and when he and some other boys were playing with fire, literally. Afterwards, he had numerous grafts and operations, although he felt repulsed by his image in the mirror because of all the scars. His self-confidence plummeted, and he became a kind of a loner, withdrawing from other people. He loved animals, though, and he hoped maybe one day he could become a veterinarian. By the time he finished high school, his facial scars were less prominent. He was still shy and inexperienced with women, and but he had been acquainted with a girl from high school, Sandra or Sandy Betten, who was the same age as he was. She was a rather difficult young woman. She had already been married at 17, but was tempestuous and quarrelsome, throwing away her wedding rings one after the other, which her husband, James Murphy, kept buying for her. She smashed dishes, cut furniture, and she once hit James with a table leg. The marriage didn't last, and she then seduced Stephen, who was happy to be initiated into sex with such an attractive woman. Which shows you that beauty sometimes is only skin deep.
Hey.
That's the only part of her that was nice. They were both 20 at the time. He refused to marry her until he finished veterinary school some 4 years later. She would then threaten to leave him for another man. And provoked by his jealous taunts, her jealous taunts, he once choked her in a violent rage. She then made her threat good. She left him for this guy, Dwayne Johnson, some other fellow. Stephen began stalking her and Dwayne, whom she then did marry, and she would send threatening letters. He would send threatening letters or else shoot buckshot at members of Sandy's family. Escaping to an uncle in Oklahoma, Stephen was caught when he was 23 and sentenced to 1 to 5 years hard labor. But he was soon paroled and now free to plan a more serious revenge. Having played with literal fire at 9, he now began playing with metaphorical fire via a plot to kill Sandy and her family. Rejected by veterinary school because of his felony, he got a job instead working in a laboratory. He also joined a devil cult involved in Satanism. At the lab, he got hold of a poison that was said to cause cancer in chickens, methyl nitrosamine, a methylating compound that attaches to and alters one's DNA. He tested the drug on a cat and dog who duly expired as expected, though from bleeding, not from cancer. The drug attacks the liver and damages the clotting system, causing massive bleeding, and predisposes to cancer over the course of time. So in 1978, Stephen sneaked into the Johnson home, and he laced some milk and lemonade with the poison. Later that day, Sandy's husband and daughter, Sherry, had some of the milk. Sandy's sister and her husband and their 11-month-old baby, Chad, had also had some of the milk and the lemonade. All 5 quickly became ill. Sandy's husband, Dwayne, and their nephew, Chad, died a few days later from extensive liver damage and profound bleeding from everywhere because the drug reduces the platelet count to 0.
So you just bleed out then?
Yeah. Harper prided himself in having created a perfect murder which would cause cancer sometime later that would not be suspected of having been set in motion by some carcinogenic compound years before. But when the police recognized that 5 people became seriously ill from the Johnson household, 2 dying within days, they suspected foul play. Knowing that Stephen Harper's record and his animosity toward Sandy and Dwayne, and learning from the 2 autopsies that a chemical toxin had caused their death, they checked his home, and there they discovered vials of dimethyl nitrosamine, and that he had worked at a laboratory where, by golly, that compound was made.
What a coincidence.
The police now arrested Harper and charged with 2 counts of murder and 3 counts of poisoning with intent to kill. This was a death penalty case. Harper spent 12 years awaiting execution and submitting one appeal after the other. Considered mentally unstable, after a while, he was given chlorpromazine, or Thorazine, which he didn't swallow, saving the pills up instead, with which he then committed suicide. So he gave himself his own death penalty. What makes the Harper case special is not the jealousy aspect. Jealousy murders are common. There was a certain aspect of Harper's murders that were not so common. He was not trying to kill an unfaithful spouse or lover. His main intended victim was his former wife. Also, he was not relying on one of the more often used poisons like cyanide that James Cahill used to kill his wife. Harper had hoped to induce a cancer of some sort that could happen to anyone years later, that therefore could not be linked to him. He aimed at a perfect, although not immediate, murder, and he was using a poison never used before as a murder weapon. That was the new part of the otherwise old evil jealousy murder. Another novel poison, rare outside of Asia, is aconite from the aconitum plant, a cardiac and nerve poison. Now, there was just as another case, there was a jealous woman from the Sikh community in England. Lakhvir Singh had been lovers for some many years with Lakhvinder Chima, but he wanted to settle down and have children. So he was about to marry a woman of 21, Gurjit Chung. As their wedding day approached, Lakhvir sneaked some curry into their fridge, laced with aconite. Later that day, her former lover and his fiancée ate some of the curry, and they soon fell ill. Lakhvinder became suspicious that Lakhvir was trying to poison them, and he called for an ambulance, but he died within hours anyway. Gurjit survived. Aconite was found in Lakhvir's purse, and she was arrested and sentenced for some reason to 23 years rather than longer in prison.
Only 23.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was?
I have no idea. 20, 25, 23.
23
it's
is
a
very odd.
peculiar.
Yeah.
It's a funny.
You don't get the full penalty. We'll take 2 years off for you.
Yeah. Yeah. But all of these, I have a whole series of these too clever by half
Yeah.
attempts at killing somebody with a rare poison or a poison that's not supposed to work for 10 years. By that time, no one makes the link between
Yeah.
except that what the guy didn't realize was that
The dosage.
you could die from cancer 10 years later. You could die 2 hours later from bleeding out,
Yeah.
which he didn't seem to realize.
A little bit of the wrong dose, maybe.
Yeah. But where their
heads are, to
plotting,
premeditate.
these are
it.
the predatory, the plotting,
Predatory
carefully-
aggressors, the ones that premeditate and plan everything out.
which means they have one in law. It's called mens rea, or the evil mind. It's
Okay.
a Latin phrase, the
Mhm.
mens rea, MENSREA, 2 words. The mens rea. It really was. I think our term malice aforethought
Okay.
is the equivalent of mens rea. So that a murder committed with mens rea, with malice aforethought, which is typical of these
Yeah, these premeditated
people,
ones.
is much more serious than the guy that the lawyer Rao that
That just
killed his
lost
family
his
with a
shit.
bat when he just lost it.
Yeah.
So
There's a little bit more of a heavy hand, I guess, for the ones that have the premeditation.
I mean, it's rare to get a death penalty, even in states where they have a death penalty, or even in California, we get the death penalty. It just means you stay in prison forever.
Yeah.
Unless there's this malice aforethought, mens rea quality, to the crime.
Just depends on the heinousness, huh?
Yeah, literally. Yeah. And we don't use the word heinous, atrocious, vile, repugnant, unless there's mens rea. That's our.
Oh, really?
Well,
so you
yes. In other words, because the fact that the person plotted to torture or kill or hurt somebody in a very awful way is simultaneously elicits the word heinous from the public.
Of course.
Or
Yeah,
atrocious.
I did, yeah.
But legally, the lawyer will say, well, this person, the prosecutor will say, this person had mens rea and deserves, the condign punishment of death penalty. Whereas if it was like the lawyer Rao, they would say, well, it's a awful crime, but not quite.
Yes,
doesn't have the
doesn't have
quality
the
of
mens rea,
atrocity.
right.
In other words, when you carve your wife up in 14 pieces, that's different.
Yeah,
from
there's
hitting
a
her over
little
the
bit
head
of
with a
darkness
baseball-
to that,
with
yeah.
a baseball bat.
Yeah, there's a little bit more.
Yeah,
You go a little bit deeper when you do something like that.
yeah. I mean, especially with 3 strikes and you're out. With a baseball bat. But anyway,
14 pieces and
but carving your wife up in little pieces has a different quality.
I never
Especially putting through your dad's buzzsaw that you have
yeah.
in the carpentry.
oof. But then you put it in a plastic bag, which I never understood. Like, all these killers always put body parts in plastic bags.
Yeah.
Plastic doesn't break down, though. They're gonna stay there. Like,
Yeah,
wouldn't you
for
want it to break down?
eternity,
Yeah,
yes.
wouldn't like if people are gonna be looking for it, wouldn't you want it to decompose and go away
Yeah.
naturally, not stay hermetically sealed in a plastic
Well,
bag?
the only thing you could do is to take it to the place where you want to dig a little hole and bury it,
Yeah.
and dump it out of the plastic bag.
Yeah, just so it decomposes naturally
Yeah.
and returns to the soil. But
Yeah.
who was the one that dumped his wife overboard in California not that long ago? Chopped up her body?
Oh, Scott Peterson.
Scott Peterson, yeah. The same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was in plastic bags, and they all floated to the surface.
Yeah, and washed up on the shore
Yeah.
instead of in the middle of the Pacific.
Yeah, if he
He
didn't
thought
have
they
it
would
in
go out to
plastic
the middle of the
bags.
Pacific and be,
Part of that plastic island.
5,000 miles away and hundreds of feet.
Feet underwater.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but,
The buoyancy of gases, I guess, when it decomposes, makes it come to the top.
well, the same thing with, Melanie McGuire. The one that carved her husband up in 3 pieces and put them in suitcases with 5-pound weights.
Yes.
Rather than 50-pound weights. So that, of course, the gases lifted everything. And the little boy was, "Oh, Daddy, the suitcases in the Chesapeake Bay when it was in the rowboat."
Yes, yeah. And open up one of those must not have been fun.
Well, even if it was just a decomposing bone, like a leg, it's pretty smelly and ugly.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, you can...
As a matter of fact, I read yesterday, probably in the Post, there was a plane coming from maybe Portugal to somewhere, and a guy on the plane hadn't bathed in forever and smelled so horrible that people around him were vomiting.
Oh, my
So
God.
they had to divert they had to land it prematurely somewhere and let all the people off. And
Because someone didn't want to shower.
gee.
Oh, man. I mean, I've been in situations where the person next to you has bad BO, but
I had that once happen
vomit,
in the train, and I was going, giving a lecture somewhere in the outskirts of Paris rather than in Paris itself. And I was with a bunch of other people. We were all giving talks, and we took the subway. I don't know the Paris. I've been in Paris probably 50 times. Never take the subway.
Oh, yeah.
Because I don't know the subway system. I take a taxi.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah.
but my friend, he said, well, we'll take he knew the subway system. Okay, fine. So we got on the subway, but there was a poor guy there, who, again, hadn't bathed, in
Quite some
a
time.
very long time. And it was very awkward and unpleasant.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It seems like every time I go to like a theme park, I seem to get a group of them that are by you, and they seem to be standing online for 45 minutes with you, and it's like those 45 minutes are
Yeah.
they're
it's
deplorable.
really-
They're demoralizing after a few.
Yeah. Well, the Long Island cab driver, Sal Inghilleri, was 31 when he was charged back in '94, was sexually abusing the then 11-year-old Katie Beers. Years before, when she was just a toddler, he was not charged at the time for that offense. He compounded his mistreatment of Katie further by taking Katie's cat and bashing its head against the wall, while killing the animal while Katie watched.
Oh.
That's pretty awful. Inghilleri served 12 years for the sexual molestation of Katie, who later, when she was 9, had been kidnapped by another Long Island man, Johnny Esposito, who was a family friend of Inghilleri. Esposito had created a dungeon right below his house, where he kept Katie as a sex slave for 2.5 weeks. That was in '91, until he was finally caught and arrested. Though paroled in 2006, Inghilleri was arrested again for failing to notify the authorities that he had moved to a different location in North Carolina. Esposito was sentenced to 15 years to life. He was one of the earliest cases of kidnap for sex slavery, before the more prolonged cases of Phil Garrido, Ariel Castro, Thomas Hose, and the Austria of Wolfgang Preklopil, who kept someone for Kampusch, for I think 8 years, and Joseph Fritzl for 18 years. Inghilleri died in prison just a few months ago, in 2018.
Oh, wow.
Fortunately, Katie Beers was made of stronger stuff than most victims who suffered as she had. Now in her mid-30s, she's married with 2 children, and she has become an inspirational speaker. She has told her story in her book, Buried Memories, Katie Beers' Story. And by the time she was imprisoned by Esposito, she had already endured physical and sexual abuse at the hands of her godmother's husband, Ingelary, and, as she put it, was physically, emotionally, and verbally abused by all the adults who were supposed to take care of me. Despite the depravity she experienced, she tried to keep a shred of hope. I knew from an early age that not all people were bad. Now that's a remarkable quality about some people that can go through this kind of stuff and
still
not be totally soured.
Yeah, still keep a positive outlook.
Yeah. Katie had the good fortune, after getting released from Esposito, to be placed in a supportive foster family, and after that to be in therapy with an excellent therapist in East Hampton, Mary Bromley. Katie has expressed the hope that one day, after enough survivors have the courage to speak out about their abuse, that there will be no longer a stigma associated with surviving. We know a few things that helped Katie Beers surmount the evil influences that bore down on her so hard during her younger days. The good foster parents, the good therapists, but we know little about the basic makeup of persons who have endured such a past and been able to rise above it. All too many girls who have gone through what Katie Beers went through do not do well.
Yeah.
Some become promiscuous, some become morbidly jealous, some avoid sex altogether, some develop borderline personality disorder, others become seriously depressed and even commit suicide. But others were dealt from birth a better genetic hand, the nature of which we scarcely understand. Katie Beers is an example of what has been called in child psychiatry the invulnerable child. So there's something good about their genetic
Disposition.
disposition that allows them to surmount even horrible troubles like that, realize that, well, as she was saying, not all people are bad, most people are good, and I don't have to judge everybody by the people that were injuring me, etc., and to keep a good outlook. It's very, and what it is about their normal brain, that, or even extra normal brain, we have very little understanding of it from a standpoint of the brain chemistry or the neuroscientific aspects of it.
Yeah, what makes her maybe activity more prefrontal? I don't know if I'm using the right area of the brain, but as it operates at a different capacity to be able to have that compassion to, even though you've dealt with all those injustices, to be able to still have that, maintain that positive outlook.
Yeah, it's
pretty remarkable, huh?
Yeah. So I mean, and people like that are less often studied. But first of all, there aren't that many, who like she, who, but they deserve as careful examination about their brain as the bad guys.
I agree.
But people are more intent upon going into a prison or into a forensic hospital or some other facility, where there are people who've done what people call evil acts, and seeing what they can find out about their brain, rather than to see, well, okay, but let's not neglect our inquiry about the brains of people who have been able to rise above circumstances that crush most people otherwise.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We always dwell on the negatives, huh?
Yeah. Another in the annals of perfect murders is the story of Mel Ignatow and his 1988 murder of his girlfriend, Brenda Sue Schaefer. She had complained of his abusiveness and had planned to break off the relationship. He did not take the rejection lightly, and then planned, with the help of a former girlfriend, Mary Ann Shore, to lure Brenda to Mary Ann's house. They all lived in Louisville, Kentucky. When Brenda showed up, carrying some jewelry that he had given her, to return to him, Mel, at gunpoint, locked her in the house, blindfolded, gagged, and bound her hand and foot. After stripping her naked and photographing her in suggestive positions, he raped and sodomized her, then, beating her and killing her with chloroform, he and Mary Ann then buried her behind the house. Though Mel was a suspect, there were no witnesses or other evidence, just Schaefer's mysterious disappearance. The police did interview Mel anyway, and he mentioned Shore's name. This gave them reason to talk with her as well. And she confessed not only to the murder that they had so meticulously planned, but also to the photographs Mel had made while torturing her. Promising Mary Ann with charging her with no more than evidence tampering, they got her to wear a wire and talk to Mel. He reassured her they'd never find Brenda's body because it was buried too deeply, but not too deeply for the police to exhume and find the body, the now decomposed body. There was a trial, but it did not go well for the prosecution because the star witness, which was Mary Ann, dressed vampishly and laughed during her testimony, as though all a giggle. The jury thought perhaps she was the killer, and at all events acquitted Ignatow.
Wow.
Half a year later, however, workmen at Ignatow's house discovered a plastic bag under a floor vent. The bag contained rolls of film which showed, when they were developed, photos of Mel torturing and raping Brenda Schaefer. Because the laws concerning double jeopardy, he could not be tried for the murder, to which he now confessed. So he was instead sentenced to prison on 2 separate occasions for perjury. Released in 2006, he died at home 2 years later from an accident that strikes us like God's belated punishment.
What happened to
He
him?
fell and struck his head against a glass coffee table and bled to death.
Wow.
What gives Ignatow's murder of Brenda Schaefer the overtones of the new evil is the grotesque and totally unnecessary preliminaries to the eventual taking of someone's life. Nor was it a response to any cruelty that she ever inflicted on him. All she did was to say that she didn't want to see him anymore. The murder was a far cry, far in the direction of heartless egoism, than the murder of Ruth Snyder's husband by Ruth and her new lover, for which both were executed in 1928. They just throttled the husband so that they could be together. No torture, no naked pictures. People throughout the ages, when cruelly wronged by someone, have been prone to elaborate fantasies of cruel retribution. Fantasies, but rarely acted out. We are seeing a greater number of persons in the last half-century in whom the moral barriers and restraints against actually carrying out tortures or tortuous acts of revenge are no longer in place. If you can think it, you can do it, as in Ben Sifrit's having sex with the head of the woman he had just invited to his home and beheaded. We're in the J's. So sadism is encountered much more often in men than in women, but there are some notable exceptions. Lois, I'll call her Juergens, her maiden name was Zerwas. It looks as though it could be Juergens, but she probably said Juergens. Was one of an evenly divided 16 children, 8 boys, 8 girls, born to a shiftless, usually unemployed, impoverished alcoholic father known for being brutally abusive toward his wife and children, including Lois. She had been anoretic until 13, which is very, very late. In other words, most kids get bladder control by the time they're 2 or 2 and a half. She was 13. And she was a compulsive neat freak, preoccupied with fears of cancer and death, and subject to frequent nightmares. She married Harold Juergens and lived in a place called White Bear Lake, which is kind of a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota. Unable to have children because of his sterility, the couple tried to adopt a child, but they were at first turned down because of Lois's history of 2 previous psychiatric hospitalizations for depression and psychosis, treated with electroconvulsive therapy. So she had ECT, and they decided that was not
the
best kind of a mother to give an adopted kid to. She and her husband then went to the informal route and adopted first a boy, Robert, in 1960, and then another boy, Dennis, in 1962, after he had been a year in a foster home. Robert, the more obedient and placid child, gave Lois little trouble, but Dennis was a more typical boy, active, high-spirited, And that stressed Lois, an angry woman with a very short temper, and pushed her far beyond her capacities. Toward Dennis, she became extremely punitive, battering him for trivial things. She indulged in a kind of sexual sadism rare in a woman, doing such things as pouring boiling water on his penis, if he were to wet his bed, or wet his diaper too often, or put a clothespin with a pinch clamp on the end of his penis, or bite him on the penis or scrotum, leaving scars all over his genital area. Did I say she was nice?
Oh, jeez.
She would tie his limbs to the bedpost to make sure he stayed in bed, or tie him to the toilet until he finally had a bowel movement. All these cruelties she justified as being a staunch Catholic doing God's work by making Dennis perfect.
Religion.
She made Dennis pray and recite the rosary while kneeling on a broomstick.
Oh.
On other occasions, she would feed him bitter foods and then cover his mouth and nose until he sickened and vomited, and she would then force him to eat the vomit. When Dennis had been with the Jurgens for 2.5 years, Lois smashed him in the abdomen with a blunt object. That blow caused a traumatic rupture of the bowel, which then led to fecal peritonitis, which killed him in 1965. Lois pretended the child had just fallen down the stairs, even though he had bruises all over his body, some new, some old. But in the mid-60s, child abuse cases of this sort were not always recognized and diagnosed as such. A diagnosis at autopsy was not one of homicide. The only word given was deferred. Absent a homicide designation, Lois and Harold were free to adopt 4 more boys, who also suffered repugnant forms of abuse, such as slamming a child's head into a nail sticking out of a wall, or shoving a used sanitary napkin into a child's face. Years later, the biological mother, Jerry Sherwood, learned that Dennis had been abused, and she was able to persuade the police to look into the case 21 years after his death. After his body was exhumed, pathologists were able to discern that the boy had suffered multiple bruises and could see the perforated bowel that had led to the fecal peritonitis. There being no statute of limitations on murder, Lois was finally tried for murder and sentenced in 1987 to 25 years. She served only 8 and died in 2013. The case drew national attention and helped pave the way for a broader recognition of child abuse, specifically of what came to be known as the battered child syndrome. A large literature, both scholarly and governmental, on child abuse in general and on sexual abuse of children began to emerge in the 1960s and 1970s. Among them, Childhood Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act and articles on deciding the truthfulness of sexual abuse allegations in custody disputes.
Now, do you think it was because of the heinousness of her crimes, or because she was actually a female? You're saying that now, like, this was basically the tipping point.
Yes.
For the research of, child abuse and child.
Well, the heinousness.
The heinousness of.
Yeah.
I've had some good reactions in the past to your stories, but that was a new one. You had Christian doing a little.
Well, there's the worst one we may have talked about, Gertrude Benishevsky. Remember the woman? There was a couple that wanted to entrust their kid to a home for a couple months while they went to a vacation in Florida,
Yes.
in Indiana, and they entrusted the girl, Sylvia Likens was her name, to Gertrude Benishevsky, who had a bunch of children, one a little bit older than Sylvia, but Sylvia was much prettier, so there was a profound jealousy on the part of, or envy
Gertrude's
would be the
daughter.
right word, on the part of the older daughter. And Gertrude subjected Sylvia to all manner of unspeakable crimes. She was the one, besides making her eat her vomit, took a hot needle and burned a message in her abdomen saying, I'm a prostitute, and glad of it, things like that. And they pushed her downstairs. They battered her every which way. Eventually, starved her to death. And when the parents came back, the girl had died the day before of starvation, but enduring incredible numbers of physical batteries.
Horrible atrocities.
Really atrocities. And she was considered one of the most evil people ever. It was, in Quora, they sing when I look in my email or my new, the Quora has a series of questions and answers about a lot of different subjects. And somebody said, "Who's the most evil person that ever lived?" And the answer was Gertrude Beneševsky.
Wow.
For what she had did to Sylvia Likens. It would be. I think even the Nazis, they're so busy killing 6 million Jews, 500,000 gypsies, a couple of million Poles, and they didn't have time to
think of the atrocity,
weeks and weeks, to the torture of one individual. Just
wow.
put him in the gas. So that she's
the magnitude of what that poor girl went through,
the torture. David Parker Ray, of course, would be, I think, really the equivalent.
Yeah,
we just don't know the details. The fact that he had this toy box and had all these drawings of shoving huge things into the vaginas of a woman with needles. It must have been quite similar. But with Sylvia Likens and Gertrude Beneševsky, we know the details more. Okay, so the last one.
Yep.
Jerry Jenkins and Ron Kennedy were two men in their early 20s from working class families in Casper, Wyoming. Both were juvenile delinquents. Ron's father was alcoholic and died in '69. Jerry's father was a truck driver who beat Jerry and his other three children mercilessly. Jerry and Ron teamed up and slashed the tires of a young woman whom they would then volunteer to, quotes, help to get her tire fixed. They would then abduct the woman and rape her. So in 1973, they did this trick on Becky Thompson and her younger half-sister, Amy Burridge. They drove them as if to help Becky with her car to a remote place near the Fremont Canyon Bridge. After torturing and raping Becky, they threw both girls over the bridge, a 110-foot drop. Amy, age 11, died instantly. Becky, at 18, survived, though much damaged. Jerry had the more serious record of juvenile delinquency. He had been in and out of jail numerous times as a juvenile delinquent. When he was 28, he married a girl of 16. They had 2 children, but he mistreated her and she planned a divorce on the same day, as it happened, that the murder on the bridge had occurred. Both Jerry and Ron were tried for the murder and given the death penalty, which ended up as life in prison without parole, since around that time the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional. Jerry died in prison when he was 54. As for Rebecca, one could hardly imagine her life going more downhill, literally and figuratively, but it did. She was later raped by her psychiatrist, later marrying and then divorcing when she became seriously depressed. Later still, she had a boyfriend and went with him and her young daughter 20 years after the incident on the bridge, back to the same bridge. This time, she threw herself over the bridge, committing suicide.
Wow.
The well-known true crime author Vincent Bugliosi, when reviewing the book about the murder, said, "This was a type of evil not too often succeeded." I think he means outdone.
Yeah.
Perhaps prophetically, Rebecca, the week before her return to the bridge, had bought a movie called Ode to Billy Joe, watching it over and over, about a boy who couldn't cope with the memory of having been sexually abused by an older man, and who had then committed suicide by jumping off the Tallahatchie Bridge in Mississippi.
I wonder where she got the idea.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you for your time again. Another enlightening episode of Happy Tales.